Well, welcome everyone to the special October 7th, 2021 briefing for the Housing and Community Development Committee. I think I will, ask for suspension of the rules, I guess, to allow us to meet virtually. This is pursuant to a determination that in-person meetings of our boards and commissions and committees are not practical or prudent due to the ongoing coronavirus, and so therefore we may attend by other means such as our current virtual setup here. So our main, do we have any members of the public?
Yes, we have one person of the public.
Anybody who wants to make a comment though, or just here to listen?
So there is a public comment time. If the person that is there would like to provide some comment, they are welcome to raise their hand with a feature at the bottom of their screen to provide some comment, and we'll be unmuting them. And then I'm also going to double check that we haven't received any recent written comment as well.
Thanks.
If you
Thank you. Thanks.
Second. And we have no written comments. And no comments from the public that is here with us today at this time.
Great. Well then, Sarah, why don't we turn it over to you to walk us through our HUD action plan and get us all up to speed on that complicated document.
Thank you, Councilmember Revelle, Chair Revelle. We're specifically going to be taking committee members through the consolidated plan that leads to the action plan today, because our formula grants have a formula for managing them. And it's, the document is, I don't know, 150 or more pages, and it's pretty dry. If you ever need a something to, if you're an insomniac, I can recommend it. There's a lot of good information, but it can be a little bit hard to slog through. And so what we really wanted to do is take you through how it is, the structure of it, what kind of information is contained in it, where the information comes from, the additional information we sought and got locally to inform the development of that plan, and then getting to the point of the strategic plan part of it, which just is a real summary of the goals. Because when we get into the action plan, you are going to see proposed funding by goals, and this will help explain how we arrived at that. Just as a reminder, we said before, we have to do our action plan for 2022 based on an estimated grant, post it for 30-day public comment period, have a public, opportunity for public comment at a meeting, and I'll do all this prior to January 1, which is the start of our fiscal year. Otherwise, we can't put any of our costs back to the start of our fiscal year once we get our HUD grants, which historically we get generally in about August of the year of our fiscal year. So, at least the federal government passed a continuing resolution, so we didn't have a partial shutdown on the 30th, on October 1st. So I look at that as optimistic. Try to retain some level of optimism, but it does, even though it seems odd to do this percentage of funding, we want to show you how that has been arrived at and kind of the way this works, and then individual projects and programs and projects that the city historically has always done through our CDBG funding, like our CDBG code enforcement and our housing rehab program, and even things like administering our grants. Those we will put estimated amounts in the draft action plan so that that makes it kind of okay for us to go ahead and continue these programs and services that are really vital to the well-being of our city. Then a reminder, the category that usually got the most time devoted to it by the Housing and Community Development Act Committee was the public services, which are basically human services or social services. That portion has gone to our Social Services Committee, but this committee has home and affordable housing fund and other things that are really, this committee oversees the built environment and economic development. So it's the housing projects and programs, regardless of funding source, the public facilities and infrastructure, which is a CDBG thing, and then also economic development, that even though we don't normally allocate a lot of money for it, is going to be from our CDBG, largely because of other city resources, is something that will be under this committee. So I'm going to have Marion start taking us through a series of slides. It will be top line. Joanne, I can see you're going to be familiar with the home stuff, but you haven't seen all the CDBG stuff. Councilmember Ravel, you've seen the home stuff and not the CDBG stuff. So, and Lauren, you're seeing a lot of this for the first time.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you know, I'm sure, you know, we've got, I think, about 30 slides, but we will go at a pace that where it makes sense. We don't want you to feel you can't ask questions. You can, but you know, I will admit this is top line there, you know, because a lot of stuff in this HUD stuff is pretty wonky. It's like, why does that happen? Oh, never mind. But we can explain some of that too, and will on an ongoing basis. So I'm going to turn over to Marion now to get started. And as I say, please, you know, feel free to ask questions and we'll attempt to answer them as we go along.
Thanks,
Okay.
Sarah. I just want to mention that our member Hugo Rodriguez is attempted to join, but he's having some technical issues. So be on the lookout. He may be in the attendance and might need to be promoted as panelist as I present. Sarah, I didn't make you co-host so that if you find that you're able to do it. But I can always do that at the end of the presentation as well during Q&A. So I'm going to be sharing my screen in a quick second. If you can all confirm that you're seeing the presentation in Google Slide.
Yep.
And that you see it in the presentation view.
Yes, indeed.
Yep. Great. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to be reviewing the consolidated plan from HUD today. And like Sarah mentioned, this is a 168-page document that we're attempting to summarize in under 30 minutes and about 30 slides. So not everything is in here. You are welcome to review the full document as well as other document on the city's website. There's a link here. There's a shortcut, cityofevanston.org/conplan, which has all the information. And the consolidated plan for 2020-2024 also actually includes an action plan at the end for that year. The consolidated plan is a very prescribed format with very specific categories, high level of what we're supposed to review and provide some information and context on. Those categories are the needs assessment, market analysis, strategic planning, like I was saying, the annual action plan for that year. It's using data sources that are mostly coming from the American Community Survey. So at the time, which was 2018, we were writing the con plan with survey data from 2011 to 2017. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Can I ask one? Sorry, can I ask one question about that?
Yeah.
This is my only question about the whole thing, I promise. I won't interrupt a lot, but I actually did look at the plan before this meeting, and I noticed that in the summary, and maybe if you're going to get there, please tell me, but it talked about how there's been a demographic shift. Are you going to go over that?
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, definitely. And
right.
feel free to interrupt, because this is meant to be an overview for you guys to understand what's in the plan. So if there's question or clarification, it's helpful. It's likely helpful for somebody else as well.
Okay, all right.
So no problem with interruptions at all. So one key point around the data sources that we need to keep in mind for Evanston, the Consolidated Plan is using this data, and this data is the ACS, American Community Survey, is very much working on a kind of small sample data set that they then project for the whole census block group or community. And what ends up happening is, in some cases, large swings. So we use as a data as a way to kind of provide some direction, but it is not necessarily all that is to the story. And we have to use a grain of salt with this data, especially in our community, because it's smaller scale of data sample. And here's an example of what we mean by that. So when we were working on the consolidated plan, we used the low moderate income maps. We created the low moderate income maps, and those maps are based on the ACS, and they're based on the percentage of low moderate income household in a given block, so census block. So you can see here as an example, between 2014 and 2020, we had big shifts in between the census block groups that were considered majority low moderate income in 2014 versus 2020. And here's an area right here, 8092.04, which in 2014 was considered 11% low moderate income, and in 2020 was considered 61%. Now we know from the field and what we know about our community that there's not been any drastic change, and that this is likely to be, generally speaking, an area that is low moderate income. The data, however, and the maps that we have to work with to be able to, as an example, determine whether a program is eligible for CDBG funding does not necessarily see that. So that's something that we just have to use when we're working on some of our programs. And that's something that kind of exemplify the need to understand the data that we're getting and review the data, but also understand our community and kind of layer in other point of data.
Marian, I just want to make one other comment about these, the low and moderate income areas. One of the other weird things is in our 2014 through 2019 consolidated plan. So that's the map on the left. We were also what is known as an exception community. To be a low and moderate income area eligible for things that are done on an area basis, the census block group or census tract has to have an population that is 51% or more low and moderate income. But some communities have done a better job of integrating their low and moderate income residents within their overall community. And so they become what are known as exception communities. And the data that are used is they put all of the census block groups in rank order, and you look at the top quartile and they do a bunch of calculations. So in the 2014 through 19, 15 through 19, sorry, con plan, we were an exception community, and our level of our percentage of low mod residents that made it an area benefit was 45.13, which happens to be one of the census block groups that is actually, because that was the lowest one that was used in that calculation. But with the data we got for the 2020 through 2024 con plan, that had changed dramatically. So we were back up to being our low mod threshold was back up to 51% or higher. And I got to tell you, the areas just haven't changed that much. So when we say the data can be really wonky, that's another way of exemplifying it.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so with that said, one of the main category of the comp plan is the needs assessment and trying to understand better our community. And when we do the needs assessment, we're looking at several categories of topics. We're looking at housing needs, homeless needs, non-homeless special needs, and non-housing community development needs. So we're going to go over a few of the highlights or key points that were discussed in the comp plan as far as that. For the housing needs assessment highlights, really the key point is things that are not necessarily going to surprise you. The major key point is the cost burden. We have a high percentage of households that are cost burden in Evanston, with a heavier weight for that on renters. They're more likely to experience cost burden. They're more likely to have one or more housing problems. We're also seeing a much higher proportion of households that have one of the 4 housing problems, which for us tends to mean cost burden, that are Black or African American households. And then there's also what we saw was a high growth in the Hispanic population. We see a big jump between 2000 and 2010 census, and they're predominantly low moderate income. So those were some of the key highlights. Of course, the fact that low moderate income household being cost burden or severely cost burden with a majority at 76% is not very surprising in a high cost community like ours.
Were those 4 problems identified by HUD?
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was sort of I thought the third bullet was okay. I was just curious where they came from.
They're preset. So the housing problems are preset as far as what we report and what they track.
Got it.
What we know is the cost burden. That's the one that's really the major one for us.
And HUD uses that more than one person per room to determine overcrowding, which they use as sometimes. So, yeah.
Yeah, I figured that's what it was used for. But yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Now, when it comes to homeless needs, it's very, very difficult to get an accurate portrayal of what we're dealing with as far as homeless needs. What we know is we had at the time of the report, about 1,000 unduplicated Evanston residents and about 859 households that were served. We know that they were predominantly Black or African American. But what we also kind of need to take into account is the fact that it doesn't show in that data all the families that are unstably housed, that are couch surfing, that are living with another friend or family or doubled up. And that's kind of a hidden need that's not necessarily shown in the data. And that's something that, go ahead, sir.
Sorry. One of the real challenges about what we're supposed to use to analyze homeless needs is this thing known as the point in time count. And the point in time count happens usually in the last week of January. It is one day, and a whole lot of volunteers get out in all parts of suburban Cook County and try to count homeless people. There's also a count from the sheltered. In other words, there's the sheltered homeless count and there's the unsheltered homeless count. And most of us in the, shall we say, parts of the country that have cold weather, you know, when you start trying to do an unsheltered homeless count in Evanston in January, you know, homeless people are not stupid. Most of them, if they don't have shelter, are riding the L. They're going out to the airports and stuff like that. So this is an ongoing challenge. We all believe that our homeless population is undercounted, our unsheltered homeless. And the other thing is when you have a geography the size of Cook County, you can't even get to a lot of places. Plus there are safety issues. For example, we know at one point that we had a number of people who were living under some of the bridges along the canal. Well, the point in time count takes place in the evening and at night, usually from starting at about 8 o'clock till, midnight, because that's when they figure people are going to be in the place that they're going to sleep. But there are also safety issues. So, we really have to take any information from the homeless point in time count with a real grain of salt. And the information we get from our homeless providers in Evanston are really a much more important source, even though we have to use what we have from the point in time in our con plan.
Okay, so special needs assessment. We're here looking at population that might require assistance or supportive housing. We have about 9% of the population age 5+ that we're reporting a disability, and about almost half of the 65+ population in our community that live with a disability. And the needs that were identified were essentially permanent supportive housing to address homeless or the needs of the homeless, and then a focus on rental housing for lower income households with additional support services needed as well. So that was some of the key highlights around that section. Around the community development needs, this is one of the section that is really worked on, not necessarily from data from HUD, but most likely from information from our community engagement process, as well as understanding the needs there within the community. And you'll get some more information around the community engagement and how those identified needs were found out. But essentially for public facility, we're looking at affordable housing, facilities for homeless persons, parks and rec facilities, street alley paving. And then under the public improvement, we're also looking around sidewalks, flood drainage, and sustainable infrastructure. Okay, so we're now going into the market analysis part of the con plan. So as far as the market analysis, as you may all know already, we are in a high cost built up community. We don't have a lot of vacant land. We have about 30% of our residential units that are single family, which means that the majority of our residential units are actually not single family. We have a good amount of supply for housing, but not necessarily accessible for people that are low or moderate income. And as far as size of units, what we found is that the larger units were oftentimes owner occupied, and that there was a lack as far as rentals, larger rentals. We only had 14% of renters that were in 3-bedroom or more housing, despite knowing that there's a higher demand. And as far as subsidized housing, we have about 700+ housing units that have been developed with public funds like federal, state, or local funds. And we know that we have Housing Authority Cook County waitlist that's much higher, with close to 2,000 people there.
So our Evanston, I'm sorry if I should know this, but if someone is waiting for housing and they live in Evanston, they are on a list through Cook County as opposed to a list that's run through Evanston?
That's really complicated, Lauren. That is, so the Housing Authority has its list. This is their list for both their public housing units, actually many of which are now project-based Section 8, but they're the units they own and manage, and also their housing choice voucher list. There are some buildings that are not that have separate wait lists apart from this, but this is the kind of the best way we can give some quantification of how great the need is to get that data from the Housing Authority.
Got it.
As far as housing cost, now keep in mind this data is from 2015, so things have changed since then. But already at the time, we were seeing dramatic increases in rents. We were showing 16% as of 2015, and we were seeing that on average, a household that was making 60% MI could really only afford either a studio or one bedroom unit with the kind of income they had. On the other side, for ownership, there was still kind of values that were down due to the 2000 crash, but the affordability was still an issue, with the median household income being a little bit below 70,000 at the time. And really what that meant is that they could only afford a house that was about 260,000, and our average single family detached home was 440,000. So a big gap. As we know, conditions have only deepened both for renters and for affordability of ownership since then. So this is still, well, the numbers are outdated. This is still information that's valid for us at this point.
And what size on that under renter is the second bullet, when you have a median rent of 1127? What's that unit size? Do you know? Is that usually a?
So that's median. So that's for all units.
Okay. It's
but
not okay.
Right, but essentially, yeah, that would likely be a one bedroom at that cost.
And the market, of course, has changed dramatically.
I would imagine it's worsened
since that
this
time.
population. It's less available to this population.
Yeah. As far as the condition of housing, so we have a community that's made of older construction. So based on that, we know that about 85% of our units were constructed before 1980 and almost half before 1940. And that indicates a likely need for rehab, whether it's rental or ownership. We don't necessarily have blighted areas, but there is a higher need for rehab in the lower income neighborhoods. And then we may have lead hazard as well, given the age of our housing inventory to consider. Now, as far as barriers to affordable housing, really the primary barrier is around income versus housing costs. We're very high cost, and our incomes in Evanston or nationwide are just not following or increasing as they would need to for housing to stay affordable. On top of that, we have rent increases that are very high. The other items that we see in our community, we have high property costs, and we also have large lot single family areas. What that means is that essentially we have concentration of affordable housing in specific lower cost area, and it makes it harder to have affordable housing throughout the community. And then there's occupancy standards for rentals as well, which precludes people with non-traditional family or non-traditional households to be able to lower their cost, whether it's co-housing or house sharing or anything like that. Okay, so for the community survey, a big part of the consolidated plan is to do community engagement. Now, this was done through inputs from resident and stakeholders through an online community survey, as well as paper. It was performed in summer of 2019 in preparation for the writing of the consolidated plan. And it was extensive outreach through digital, email, social media, websites, but as well through volunteers at local advocates, nonprofits, and specific outreach in some of our location or communities that we knew we needed to get more input from. So as far as the respondent age, what we're seeing in Evanston, but which is very common in most public engagement situation, is oftentimes respondent age skews older, white, and often female. What we were happy to see through the extensive outreach we did is that not only did we get a good amount of responses that were skewing younger and providing a little bit more of distribution as far as representing the community, but we were also seeing that our respondents were higher percentage Black and African American than we usually get. And we're better representing the population that we were needing to respond and to provide outreach than usual.
A really important part of, just wanted to comment, of getting this this much more diverse response from much more diverse group was we engaged the Cradle to Career advocate group to actually go into the community and talk to people. We sent them out with iPads that they could do the surveys electronically. They quickly came back and said, people are going, this is way too long. I can't do this electronically. I can try doing it on paper, but they would literally work to get, and we got over 200 surveys through that group that I don't think we would have gotten simply through our normal processes. And that, I think, is really, our surveys are never statistically projectable because we can't control them to that extent, and they're not designed as such. But I believe they really, this survey got us dramatically more useful information than the prior one, which we had done very traditional, like, you know, put it out on the internet, ask the nonprofits to get their, you know, people to fill it out, which is a tough sell. You know, so I think that we did get, as I say, very different information from a much broader group of Evanston residents that we're trying to help.
Okay, so some of the key highlights from that survey are going to be shown in the next few slides. So here we were asking what the community see as far as priority, and affordable housing was shown as being one of the top priority for the respondents. So that was definitely reflecting what we were seeing as far as the what we're seeing happening in the community as well. That's not very surprising, but at least confirms the need for this work. This slide is providing some information around specifically what the respondents that were low moderate income responded as far as priority needs. And there's a lot of information on this slide. Essentially in blue, what we're seeing is people that answered, I don't use the service, but I'm in need of that service. And in red is, I need it and I'm currently using it. And so the highlights here is that as far as the highest unmet needs, meaning they need it, but they don't have access to it right now, housing assistance, financial literacy, and skilled trade, learning a skilled trade were the top unmet needs. As far as the highest total need, we were seeing, and you can see it here in those sections here, that health services were ranking the highest, which is not necessarily surprising, but helpful to understand. And then as far as housing needs specifically, the respondents were asked to provide some priority as far as different services. And here on this chart, you're seeing what was provided as a high or medium priority according to them. It's a fairly even slide and chart, but what we're seeing is that rental housing assistance on the left and tenant landlord services on the right were the top responses if you combine a high and medium priority. Finally, for public facilities, this one was a lot more clear. What we found is, according to respondents, the top priorities were youth centers, homeless facilities, and rec centers, community centers, as far as the highest priority for investment.
So interesting. I feel like we have a lot of rec centers.
It
It's
is
just my feeling as a citizen, like that may
Right.
be totally uninformed, you know, but I can walk to two on.
Lauren, I think part of it is actually how people respond to whether they feel there is programming in the rec centers for them. And so that is something, we talked about that a lot at the time. It's like, we do have quite a lot of rec centers, but You know, and I think, I actually think that the Crown Center, the new Crown Center, has addressed some of those things, because the use of that center alone by different groups of people in our community is quite dramatically different, even during the pandemic, than the former Crown Center.
When was this survey conducted?
2019.
Okay, so before the new Crown Center was opened.
Absolutely.
So, okay, good context.
It's
Thanks.
interesting to see community and rec centers is kind of high and youth centers is the highest. So, you know, put those two together, it must be addressing concerns about not adequate programming.
Be interesting to see what the results would be this year or another year after a full
Right.
year of programming at Crown.
Right.
Yeah, and they won't be ever directly comparable, because I mean, one of the things is even though we try to do surveys that are going to get us information, we are not professional survey creators. So, you know, there are times that we look at it and go, oh gosh, maybe that contributed to some challenges in how we interpret things. It's always a lovely challenge.
So onto the strategic plan part of the con plan. A couple key points. What we found at the very high level is that in this consolidated plan that was for 2020, 2024, the main objectives was very similar to prior ones, which was affordable housing was a need and needed to be a high priority. And then, as we've mentioned before, there was also changes in the maps that was going to impact our work, as far as using CDBG funding as an example. So for under strategic plan, there's different goals that we have identified, and I'm going to go through the slides and the overview of those goals. Affordable housing, of course, being a key one, with a focus on rentals to maintain and increase the supply of affordable units. We've seen a very high need from the needs assessment exercise. There's the rehab of low-income resident owner-occupied homes, and then the maintaining safe and decent housing, monitor abandoned properties, and kind of identify anything that might need to go through demolition.
Note about housing. We are also focusing on rental because, especially when you look at the income limits of our federal funding, both home and CDBG are restricted to households with incomes that do not exceed 80% of the area median. Many years ago, well, yeah, quite a few years ago, probably about almost 10, we had down payment assistance for home buyers. And one of the things that we found with that 80% income level, we could not qualify a whole lot of people for homes that they were then able to buy. So we all know we need to address home ownership, but we're not finding our federal funding is the most effective way to do that. So we don't want people to think that there isn't a need for it, but we also can't really do much with our federal funding right now.
Around the addressing the homelessness goals, the goal here is to support services to prevent and to assist those experiencing homelessness. So here we're using street outreach, rapid rehousing, and tenant-based rental assistance. Part of our goal is to use coordinated entry and the housing first model, which provides a way to bring some stability for the person experiencing homelessness before they can move on and address other challenges, such as unemployment and other issues.
And also ESG, which provides some of those services, the street outreach, rapid rehousing, that's under the Social Services Committee. Tenant-based rental assistance is under this committee because that uses home funds. So we couldn't figure out a way to keep it divided completely cleanly between the two committees, and to divide one grant in half either way was really a nightmare.
Creating livable communities. So this is pretty much a goal that encompasses anything that's not housing related. We're looking at infrastructure, public facilities, and really focusing on maintaining and improving those infrastructures. We can use CDBG funding to make improvements to specific underinvested neighborhoods, obviously using the requirements there that are associated with CDBG. And usually that takes shape in how alley and street paving, lighting, sidewalks, parks, and public facilities.
We work obviously very closely with Laura Biggs and her group on this because they have to evaluate what the condition of our infrastructure and then look at that income eligibility map and try to figure out how we can match those needs up and effectively use CDBG. Alley paving is an example where CDBG can be very important though. Usually in Evanston, alleys are paved through the 50-50 cost sharing program. And we have, you know, you can wind up with your alley special assessment for an alley paving can be several $1,000s. And so in lower income areas, you frequently can't even get an alley paving project approved because the residents just can't afford to have that special assessment, even if we break it out over 10 years. So that means we get really uneven quality of our public facilities, and alley paving does, you know, a lot of things. It improves our ability to deliver services like garbage collection, even life safety. You know, in many cases, fire trucks use the alleys if they need to for any kind of emergency things. And it also affects things like drainage. And we know this is part of our CARP plan. How do we deal with these downpours we get where everybody gets soggy basements and everything else? So it's an important way of trying to make sure that we don't have really unevenness in our infrastructure projects based on the income of people through, you know, our processes like the, as I say, like the 50-50 cost sharing for alleys. Another little tiny piece that we have historically always funded is we have a program called Alley Special Assessment Assistance. And this is a special little weird category in CDBG where there are special assessments for things like alley paving. You can income qualify the household. And if the household income is at or below 80% of the area median, you can pay that with CDBG, except it has to be an owner occupied property. In other words, you can't do that for rental. A rental building that houses all low and moderate income people is still expected to be able to pay its special assessment. I'm not sure that that's reasonable, but that's the HUD rules. So there are certainly times that we run into things like that we, again, try to figure out ways to take care of some of those needs that really disparately affect our low-income residents, especially when it's things like these alley special assessments, seniors who are living on fixed incomes.
Yeah.
But that can be throughout the city as well. So
another goal that we have is economic development. So of course, that is meant to promote the vitality of our economy and foster growth that could provide greater local economic opportunities especially for low moderate income resident. Usually that tends to take shape in the form of workforce development, job training, or financial assistance directly to businesses. Something to keep in mind is this is a lower priority as far as funding for a couple of reasons. One is because there's other local resources that may be used for this goal. but also specifically because CDBG would be our main source of funding here, and there are very strict requirements for economic development that oftentimes does not allow us to do what we're hoping to do to have the greatest impact. Oftentimes flexibility is needed there.
I'll give a couple examples of this. So the city has a facade improvement program, and you can do facade improvement with CDBG. In fact, it can be one of the easiest things to qualify as eligible if you are doing a facade improvement for a business that is in one of our small business districts that is in a primarily low and moderate income residential area, because you're improving the quality of life for all the people in that area by improving that building. But the minute you give CDBG to a business for a construction project, they have to follow Davis-Bacon prevailing wage, which is basically union scale, which can increase the cost of the project, and also is something that smaller contractors generally do not even want to bid on projects with Davis-Bacon. We've talked to HUD about this a million times. We haven't figured out a solution for it. But we did come to the conclusion that using CDBG for anything that is bricks and sticks when you give it to a business is not a good thing. On the other hand, you can make grants or loans that are in essence just operating capital. And that's something that can be very valuable with CDBG. And that's, we've done limited loans, and that was one of the most successful ways we worked on revitalizing Howard Street. Ward 8 was a recipient of a CDBG loan. Good to Go was a recipient of a CDBG loan. So it's not that it can't work. It works under certain circumstances. But when you give a business a grant or a loan, there are kind of two areas that you can qualify them through. If you have a micro enterprise defined as having 5 or fewer employees, including the ownership, and the ownership is low or moderate income, you have the greatest flexibility in terms of how much money you can give them and how they use it. If the ownership is not low and moderate income, or even if it is and the business has more than 5 employees, you have to create new jobs that are for which low and moderate income people are eligible and get first priority. Or you have to retain jobs. Job retention requires something really, really concrete, like a declaration that the business will go out of business, literally, if they don't receive help. So that one's a really tough one to use. So we've used job creation in some cases, but again, it's challenging, and it also requires a lot of paperwork. Marion's been working on economic development things with our CDBG CV funding, which is a little more flexible and a little more forgiving than regular CDBG in terms of its paperwork, but it's pretty onerous. So that's another reason. There is a phrase that HUD told me when I first started working on CDBG, and this was actually related to the physical building things. And that phrase is touched by CDBG, tainted by CDBG, because I found out that you couldn't just give somebody CDBG to do one part of their rehab or project and just keep it to that. No, the whole project has to be covered by the same regulations. So CDBG is a wonderful source of funding, but it does have a lot of things that make it can make it uniquely challenging to use effectively under certain situations.
Thank you. And we have a question from the audience. If we can, we have 2 more slides. If we can just finish that, and maybe we can answer that question. Give me a second. Okay, so the last goal is public services. very quickly, this goal is actually now managed under the Social Services Committee. So we did add it because it is part of the consolidated plan and it is part of what's discussed there, but it is not something that's necessarily going to be discussed in HCDC. And then our final slide is the actual goals chart. So once the consolidated plan was built, we look at estimated resources for the next 5 years and attach some projections of goals to those resources. And this is the chart that you see here. So as an example, the 61 new rental units that would be affordable, or the 35 units that would be rehabbed over 5 years. So all of those are the projected goals that we have for the 5-year period 2020 to 2024. And that's kind of the key summary.
And then each year, the action plan, which would be the next step, and that's how much money did we get that year? How is it being divided out by goal? And then by ultimately individual activities, and what portion of these 5-year goals do we expect to achieve in each year? Every year, as I say, the action plan gets the goals, and every year in the Consolidated Annual Performance and Evaluation Report, affectionately known as the CAPER, because that's quite a name to remember, we have to report on how many of those goals were achieved. And this committee will get both the action plan in draft form and then ultimately the final action plan for review and approval, and also the CAPER. So you'll get to see all that every year.
And with that, this is the end of our presentation.
Before we leave that slide, so we need to create 61 new rental units by the year 2024.
Yep.
And this amount of money, the 3,184,000 CDBG funding, that's the amount of funding we expect over the period of the plan, or?
For CDBG, yes. Mm-hmm. And for home, you can see we expected just shy of 700,000 that would go against this goal. Now, keep in mind that much of CDBG is not, with CDBG, with very limited exceptions, you cannot create new housing. You can fix housing, but you can't create new housing. So those 61 new rental units are virtually it's all home. And 60 of them are the Anne Rainey apartments, because we're putting $500,000 of home into that. And we get credit for all those 60 units. And then the one unit is actually the 1930 Jackson coach house. Yep, ADU. So we hope that we will actually be able to show more than this, but when we do our estimates, we try to be realistic as well. And the home funding for those two projects that we just discussed is coming from 3 years of home. So, you know, it's really the way we get the unit count, because each unit costs way more than the amount of home we're putting in, obviously, is by using our home, and in this case, our home and our affordable housing fund, as what is known as the soft money in large developments. Soft money being money that is way down in the, you know, it's the subordinated to the primary mortgage and the, you know, tax credit funding and things like that. So even if it's done as a loan, you don't expect it will ever be repaid. We generally give our our soft money as forgivable or as deferred loans, where with home, we oftentimes use forgivable because home, you don't want to be held to home requirements any longer than you have to be held to home requirements, because it's frankly quite a pain. And you've got 20 years of it with new housing, new rental housing. Our affordable housing fund, we frequently do as a deferred loan. So we say, as long as you keep it as affordable housing, you're not going to have to pay it back. But say somebody sells the building and it isn't going to be affordable any longer, then we want our money back. So.
Okay. And then when the 1900 Sherman Avenue building is built, do we get credit for those?
We are unlikely to be funding that because it's being funded outside. So we tend to report things like that in the narrative in our caper, because we show HUD what else we're doing. And one of the things that is very important that we report on all the time, and is what our relationship with the housing authority is, and what what they're doing in our community and how we're working with them. So that's what's so weird about the way, before they did this very prescriptive form within their IDIS system, we had a much more free-flowing, like, yes, this is everything that's going on in Evanston. That I think actually informed both HUD and our public more effectively about what's really being done. But that stuff will appear in the narrative, but we can't claim it if we didn't fund it.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions from our committee members?
So this slide presentation will be available on our website? No?
Yes. So
Yes.
I'm going to be posting this presentation on the committee's page, as well as soon as we have the video recording edited, it'll also be available to watch probably tomorrow.
Right.
For any committee members that didn't get to join today, or any audience member.
Right. Yeah. Right.
I'm going to stop sharing just so I can see. I believe we have a few questions if we have time. There we go. So in the Q&A, Mary Brzezinski asked, what would be the interest rate and loan limit for business loans? As well as what would the 61 rental units that were in the goals chart look like in terms of bedroom and rent?
Okay, I can give top line on that. Interest rate and loan limit for business loans. There is no, HUD does not have a required interest rate, and they do not have a loan limit officially. But there are things that you have to look at. For example, for every $35,000 that you loan a business that is getting CDBG because it's going to create jobs for low and moderate income people, you have to create no less than one full-time equivalent job, permanent job, for every $35,000. Now that is the maximum you can give. The city can put much more specific and much higher requirements if the city chooses to do that. Historically, when we've done job creation, we have stayed around that number. We've required a job for 25,000 or 30,000. Our interest rates have depended on the rate in the market at the time. But the point of CDBG is generally to fill gaps on businesses, for businesses that can't get the market rate financing. Many of our loans are to startups or to businesses, like when Ward 8 opened on Howard Street. That's a pretty high risk. That was a pretty high risk undertaking at the time. Howard Street has come back a lot since that first work that the city, that work that the city really started. So they couldn't get market rate financing. A bank might give them some of the financing, but they certainly weren't going to give them all. With Good to Go, for example. Good to Go had an SBA loan, but the city put in both some, I think it was TIF, it might have been Economic Development Fund, I don't recall which, and also some CDBG, because again, the SBA loan didn't really cover all their costs. They had taken on complete rebuilding and revitalizing 2 separate buildings that had been vacant for a long time on Howard Street. So you had all that lovely, like, oh, unforeseen conditions when you open up a wall and you find something's, in much worse shape, or the plumbing needs, different kinds. So that's really, it's rare that CDBG, we either use it for small businesses and projects, or we are only a small portion of funding, sort of, again, that gap funding, if you will. That's about the best I can do on answering that one. The 61 rental units, in terms of bedrooms and rent, the 60 units in the Anne Rainey Apartments are all 1 and 2 bedrooms. I don't, off the top of my head, recall exactly how many of them are 2 bedroom. They're more 1 bedroom than 2 bedrooms because it is a senior restricted building. The rents are going to be, it's a low income housing tax credit project. So none of the rents will exceed 60% of the area median. There will be units at 30% AMI, 50% AMI, and 60% AMI. I don't remember the exact breakout off the top of my head. Half the units overall will have project-based support from the Housing Authority of Cook County. So half of the units, the income of the tenant cannot exceed 50% of the area median, but the tenant will only pay 30% of their income and the voucher will pick up the rest. So that functions like public housing. The single unit in the ADU will be officially restricted at 60% of area median per the home regs. We hope to be able to restrict it or to rent it at 50% of the area median. That's going to be something that HODC will have to work out at the time of rent up based on costs and cash flow. One of the challenges in Evanston when you have a small rental property, 2 to 3 units, you don't, even if all the units are affordable, you don't get any tax benefits. You don't get any property tax deductions and stuff like that. So we do everything to not over restrict our smallest units, our smallest buildings, because it can make it prohibitively hard for them to maintain their building. And the home requirements for even that 1 unit is it has to be retained affordable at or below 60% of area median for 20 years. So, and that is going to be a 2-bedroom. It's a small 2-bedroom, but it's a 2-bedroom unit.
And that was the extent of the questions that was a thank you from Mary Rosinski for your answer. That's the extent of the questions I have on the presentation. Like I mentioned, we're going to be posting both the recording and the presentation on the website.
Now, I'm hoping that this has been helpful. And again, no matter how much we tell you, I'm never sure, I will never manage to give everything. There'll always be like, oh no, wait, we forgot to tell you about that. It is kind of a, HUD grants are their own unique thing. CDBG, the federal government considers CDBG its single most complicated grant. I'm trying to look at this ARPA thing. I'm not sure that it can hold that anymore. But it is one of the things that sometimes surprises people is we are allowed to use 20% of our CDBG grant for administration, compliance, and reporting. And we historically allocate that. We don't always use all of it, but we allocate it because there is a lot of stuff that needs to be done. And CDBG, even just preparing the con plan, the action plan, and the CAPER take up a substantial amount of time, especially sometimes we joke that if it weren't in their cranky database, we could do it faster. But, you know, IDIS is its own critter. IDIS is the Integrated Disbursement and Information System. Integrated Disbursement and Information System. I can't even remember what it stands for. But it is literally, we put in all of every activity, we report on every activity, and that's what gets pulled out in the CAPER. And it's also where we draw funds. So it's like we have what is known as our LOCKS line of credit for each of our grants. And we literally have Teresa Borgia, who is our financial analyst, sees what shows up in our bills paid and identifies the CDBG things and the home things and the ESG things and submits a voucher in IDIS. Somebody in finance has to approve it. You got to have separation of responsibilities. No one person can do all tasks of that, financial security. And then usually within about 3 days, the money is delivered to our bank accounts. So, you know, and this is also what happens with our CDBG CV and our ESG CV. When we had NSP came through another weird federal database called DRGR. But so HUD has tried to simplify everything by integrating the reports and the action plans, all this stuff into IDIS. And as I say, that's why we keep saying, well, it's really prescribed. It is. And we are happy to look for additional information that informs both our committee and our residents about what we're doing, but we have to report on these things. So Joanne, when you were back on the Housing Commission, we didn't have this format of the action plan and all that stuff. That's a much more recent thing.
I don't know how you keep all those, the CDBG, how you keep them all straight. My God, your brain must be on overload. Oh.
Well, I guess there's sort of certain things that, I look at, I always joke with our planning and zoning people. I can understand HUD regulations, but I can't understand our zoning. I think, you kind of get in a it becomes your responsibility to learn it. One of the, and we, all joking aside, there are times I feel like much of what we do is try to figure out how to do what we need to do for Evanston in spite of the regulations. Realize that CDBG is really built around the needs of large cities where you have enormous, where you have neighborhoods that are at least as large as Evanston that are extremely low income. And so a lot of, that's why the area benefit and all that stuff is such a crazy quilt of what we can and can't do. And HUD says, well, you can do a survey if you don't think the American Community Survey is giving you accurate results. Yes, you can. And you have to develop the survey, get it approved by HUD, complete the survey, analyze it, and do that. So we've done that a few times, and we've had some that have worked out and we've had some that haven't worked out. But you don't want to do it lightly because it can take up a lot of time and energy and really not accomplish a whole lot. So as I said, on our public works things, we work very closely with Laura Biggs and her group and say, where do we need things and how can we effectively use our CDBG to ensure the quality of just the built environment in our lower income neighborhoods as well.
Yeah. I was wondering, do you have a lot of the data from the new census, from the 2020 census?
Zero,
Oh,
other than
okay.
the overall population stuff.
Oh, okay.
We know our population went up by 4.9%. One of the few communities in Illinois that happened. An awful lot of Illinois went the opposite direction. We don't have any of the other detail at this point. The biggest thing they're working on and did release is information for redistricting. That's the first focus of the census. Normally, we don't start getting the additional detail till at least a year later.
So Sarah,
Clearly,
yeah, if I don't want to interrupt, but I was just wondering, so can you walk us through the next steps with, so we're going to have an action plan and a public hearing and.
right. We will, the draft action plan will be developed by staff, and we're going to be putting the funding into those goals based on the percentage that we've historically expended on each, and keeping in mind that, that the reason we do it by goals is we have what in our citizen participation plan says what triggers a substantial amendment to an action plan or anything else. A change of funding for a goal by more than 20%, or the inclusion of a new goal or the deletion of a goal results in a substantial amendment, which triggers another 30-day comment period. Now we all
not envisioning doing any of that.
It's not a good thing if we can avoid it.
Yeah.
But we also put that if our grant amount that we receive itself creates a more than 20% change, say, example would be CDBG admin. If we say, oh, we think we'll get $1.8 million, and this would be our CDBG admin, and then they come in and say, no, we're giving you $3 million. Wouldn't that be a nice problem? But it would clearly proportionately screw up everything. It would create if we took 20% of a $3 million pot, it's going to be more than 20% more than a,
right.
We said if it's caused by that alone, it does not create a substantial amendment. And how to prove that? So we're not, we tried to make it, because otherwise we spend all our time on this planning function and nothing on actually doing the work, which we're trying to avoid. So we will do that draft action plan, and it will be posted by approximately the middle of November, probably just before our November meeting. We'll talk about it at our November meeting, including we will bring the committee some of the city activities that historically are CDBG funded that are actually also, it goes in tandem with our budgeting, overall city budgeting. For example, money for code enforcement, money to maintain our housing rehab program, which has always been completely CDBG funded. So if we don't fund it, we won't have a housing rehab program, and that sort of thing. So those and some public works things, because we can't get our public works projects done in the next year if we don't start planning them ahead of time. And so we'll give you budgets that will allow that, but it won't be the entire budget for anything. And then depending on the committee's willingness to say, yes, we agree with the funding for those things, we proceed. We don't do the bidding or anything like that, but the engineers would start the planning and stuff that's needed for it. And then once we get, so November, the action plan gets posted. December, we have the public comment on the action plan, the period. People can provide public comment by email, all sorts of other methods, but we also have to have a public meeting at which they can make comment. And so that generally.
Is that a joint meeting with the social services?
No, we don't think that's necessary, because quite honestly, we rarely get any public comment. We can invite them, but it just, I don't, but that, and we did note that our December meeting will be a week earlier than it would normally be as the third Tuesday, because we just didn't think anyone would want to be meeting on the 21st of December.
Sure. Yeah, okay.
That's
Yeah.
kind of a
Yeah.
little bit too much.
It'll be good to remind us about that. Yeah.
Right, and we will. But
Yeah.
so that, and then who knows when the Appropriations Acts
Mhm.
for 2022 funding will happen.
Mhm.
They could be rolled into one of these other acts that's in the way. We have no idea.
Yeah.
But once appropriations bills are approved, then HUD has, I think it's 45 days, I ought to know this, before they have to release the formula grant amounts.
Mhm.
Then we get the formula grant amounts, we have to update the action plan. And normally, then what we do is we bring that back to this committee
Right.
for approval, then it goes to council,
Mhm.
then it gets sent to HUD. HUD has 45 days to approve. And then sometime within about 3 months after that, we get access to our money.
Yep.
So yeah, it's kind of a management challenge
Mhm.
because we need to be able to do work before we actually get our funding.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, Laura,
One thing I would like, I just wanted to ask one more thing is
Okay.
if there are things that people they have specific questions on and want more information on, it would be really helpful. And we don't expect you to necessarily think of it right now, but please, please, please let us know.
Mhm.
Email Marion and me.
Sure.
And it's something that we can maybe add to a regular meeting and say, here's a little more information on that topic or something like that.
Mhm.
But it's hard to know what people are, what this triggers. Like, that makes no sense to me. Why does that happen?
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Well, I think this has been very helpful, so really appreciate it. Lauren or Jonathan or Joanne, do you have any last questions, or if not, then I think.
I'm good. Thank you, Sarah and Marion.
Yep. Okay. Well, then I think I will declare us adjourned, and thank you very much. And I hope the rest of the committee has a chance to watch the recording. That should be very helpful. So,
All right.
great.
Well, thank you all.
Okay.
All righty.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.